I was sentenced not in a courtroom, but in a corridor that smelled of damp stone and recirculated breath. The knock came before dawn, a measured, patient sound that assumed obedience. Lumen strips along the ceiling flickered in their housings, stuttering like failing hearts, and for a moment I lay still on my cot, counting the pulses of light and shadow. In the hive, dawn meant nothing, no sun reached us, but the schedule did. Arrests came early, when witnesses were tired and resistance was inconvenient. The door unlocked itself with a mechanical cough. 3 figures entered without haste, boots clicking in unison on the ferrocrete. Their armor was scuffed, paint worn thin by years of contact with walls and bodies. They did not draw weapons. They did not need to. One held a data slate, its surface glowing softly, illuminating the lower half of a face that might once have known sympathy. He did not look at me when he read the charge. He read it the way one reads a maintenance log, dispassionate, precise, and already forgotten. My crime was a line item, a discrepancy. A failure to submit the correct form within the correct cycle. The words were layered with legal qualifiers and devotional phrases, each one sanctifying the next. I tried to speak, to explain that the clerk's window had been closed, that the queue had stretched for hours, that the deadline had passed while I stood there breathing the dust of 1,000 others. The sound died in my throat. The words had no place to land. The data slate did not change. Shackles snapped around my wrists, cold and heavy, biting into skin already marked by work and neglect. They hummed faintly, a vibration that traveled up my arms and settled behind my eyes. The figure closest to me adjusted the fit with practiced fingers, ensuring circulation was restricted but not stopped. Efficiency mattered. I was guided, not pushed, not dragged, into the corridor, past neighbors who kept their doors closed and their prayers private. In the hive, survival depended on knowing when not to look. We descended levels by lift and stair, moving from habitation to transit to substructure, the air growing thicker and wetter with each drop. The walls changed from painted plasteel to bare rock reinforced with ancient braces. Water dripped from somewhere unseen, each drop echoing like a metronome counting down something inevitable. The guards said nothing. Their silence was not hostile, it was procedural. Conversation implied choice, and choice had already been removed from the equation. At a processing chamber, I was handed over to different hands. These wore gloves stained with ink and antiseptic, fingertips calloused from stamping and sorting. My identity papers were taken, scanned, and filed into a slot that swallowed them whole. I watched the corner of my life vanish into a machine older than my lineage. A clerk pressed a seal against my forearm, the ink seeping into pores, the symbol complex enough to require study. I did not study it. I felt the pressure, the cold, and then the sting as the mark set. They asked me to confirm my name. I gave it. The clerk frowned, tapped the slate, and shook his head. Obsolete, he said, and struck through it with a stylus. In its place he entered a designation, a string of numbers and letters that fit neatly into the allotted space. It looked correct. That was all that mattered. From there, I was herded with others through a series of corridors that funneled us like refuse toward a central point. Some cried. Some shouted prayers. Most were silent, conserving what little they had left. The holding area was a cavernous room carved from bedrock, lit by hanging lamps that swayed slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze that did not exist. The floor was slick with condensation and something darker that no one bothered to clean. We waited. Time stretched and compressed, measured only by the ache in my joints and the gnawing hunger that grew sharper with each passing hour. When the transport finally arrived, its doors opened with a hiss that released a wave of recycled air smelling of oil, ozone, and old sweat. Inside, benches lined the walls, already crowded with bodies pressed close for warmth or habit. I was shoved into a space barely wide enough to sit, my shackles chained to a rail to prevent movement. As the doors sealed, the sound cut off abruptly, leaving only the thrum of engines and the breathing of those around me. Someone began to recite a catechism under their breath, the words tumbling over one another in practiced desperation. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what mercy had meant before this moment. A lighter sentence, a warning, a chance to correct an error. In the Imperium, mercy was not forgiveness. It was expedience. The transport lurched into motion, and I felt the hive fall away beneath us, replaced by the unknown. I did not know where we were going. I did not need to. The destination had already been decided when the data slate lit up my cell. As the engines roared and the chains rattled, I understood with a clarity that hurt more than the shackles my life had been reduced to a resource, and resources were spent. That was the kindness of it, a clean reassignment, a faster way to die. They took us to a place that was not on any map I had ever seen, because maps were for citizens and I had already been revised out of that category. The transport's doors opened into a corridor of raw plasteel and riveted seams, the kind of passage built to endure blasts, chemical spills, and the slow corrosion of despair. The air here was colder than the hive's breath, scrubbed until it tasted like metal and antiseptic. Every surface shone with a thin film of condensation that turned boot prints into temporary ghosts. A line formed without anyone ordering it. We learned quickly what the Imperium teaches best, how to anticipate the next demand before it is spoken, how to make ourselves convenient. The guards guided us forward with baton, taps against their palms, soft, rhythmic reminders that violence was always present, even when unused. Above us, a picked sigil flickered, a stylized aquila, and a string of text that scrolled too quickly to read. It didn't matter. The symbol was the message. Obey. We passed through a threshold that smelled like burnt cloth and hot lubricant. The processing hall beyond it was enormous, not wide in a comforting way but wide like a mouth. Rows of harsh lumen arrays hung overhead, their light too white, too clean, making every bruise and stain on our skin look deliberate. Workstations lined the walls. Between them, clerks in drab robes moved like insects around a carcass, busy, precise, and utterly indifferent to the fact that the carcass was still breathing. Strip. A Vox speaker barked, and the word vibrated in my ribs. I hesitated, not out of defiance but out of habit, the last reflex of modesty. A shock baton cracked against the wall beside my head, close enough that I felt the heat of its discharge. My body moved without permission after that. Clothing came off in stiff, hurried motions. The fabric was cheap, sweat-stained, patched too many times, and I realized with a strange bitterness that even this had been mine. Not by right, perhaps, but by use. Now it slid from my hands and into a bin marked with a stencil that read Pia Pro Parocco VRY. The bin's mouth gaped like the transport door, ready to swallow whatever I had been. I stood among strangers, naked under the lights, my skin goose-fleshed with cold and shame. Somewhere behind a partition, machine voices rattled out litanies of sanitation. A mist sprayed from vents overhead, carrying the sharp, chemical bite of disinfectant. It settled on my tongue and made everything taste like penance. A cogitator station waited ahead, guarded by a clerk with a face the color of old parchment. He had no expression except the small tightening around his eyes that suggested fatigue rather than cruelty. His fingers were stained with ink, his sleeves smelled faintly of burnt wax. A servo skull floated at his shoulder, its lenses clicking as they adjusted recording. He did not ask my name. He did not ask anything that implied I still possessed one. He took my wrist, turned it, and pressed it against a metal plate that was cold enough to sting. The plate hummed, taking readings, pulse, temperature, identity markers I didn't understand. The clerk tapped his slate, frowned, and then, with a slow deliberation that felt like a ritual, he scrolled through my data. Designation confirmed. He murmured, more to the machine than to me. A second clerk approached, carrying a bundle of cloth and a canister that reeked of solvent. The cloth was a uniform, if you could call it that. Coarse fatigues dyed the color of old bruises, stiff with sizing. As he shoved it into my arms, the canister hissed and spit a fine spray across my chest and shoulders. The liquid burned slightly where it touched my skin, then went cold. It dried in seconds, leaving behind a faint sheen and a lingering smell of chemicals and damp cloth. Turn, the clerk said. I turned. A hot iron pressed into the fabric over my breastbone, not touching skin, but close enough that I felt the heat through the cloth. The scent of scorched fibers filled my nose, immediate and intimate. When he pulled the iron away, a number had been burned into the fatigue's blocky, blackened digits that looked like a wound. A designation. A label that could be read at a distance, even through smoke. Something in my chest tightened. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a mark, but I remembered the clerk striking through my name earlier, the word obsolete, spoken like a verdict. I realized then that the number was not replacing my name as a nickname might. It was replacing the idea that I had ever needed a name at all. Around me, others were being marked. Some wept quietly, some stared straight ahead, eyes glassy. One man laughed, a dry, cracked sound that ended abruptly when a baton struck his ribs. The guards didn't even look irritated. They looked like men swatting flies in a place where flies were inevitable. We were marched into a holding pen, if pen was the right word. It was a cage of iron bars and mesh, large enough to hold several dozen bodies and designed to do exactly that. The floor was metal grating that vibrated underfoot, and beneath it something moved, pipes, machinery, the underbelly of an institution that fed on people. The air was thick with sweat and fear and the sour stink of waste. A bucket sat in the corner. It was already half full. No one spoke, not because we were forbidden, though I'm sure we were, but because speech felt like a luxury. Words required breath, and breath was needed for other things, staying upright, staying quiet, staying unnoticed. In the hive, silence was how you avoided trouble. Here, silence was how you avoided being selected for something worse. Above us, clerks continued their work. I watched them through the mesh as they shuffled papers, stamped forms, and argued with cogitators that refused to accept certain inputs. Every argument ended the same way, a clerk muttering a prayer, adjusting the data, and moving on. The machine was always right, and if it wasn't, then reality had to change to match it. Hours, days, passed in fragments. We were taken one by one to stations where more stamps were applied, more measurements taken, more forms completed. Each interaction was brief and cold. A clerk would glance at my number, compare it to a slate, and nod. If the numbers matched, I existed. If they did not, I would be corrected. I saw what correction looked like. A woman 2 places down in the queue, a thin thing with bruises on her wrists, was brought before a clerk who squinted at his slate and shook his head. He tapped again, slower this time, as if patience might make the data change. It didn't. He raised a hand, and 2 guards stepped forward, taking her arms. She began to protest, voice hoarse. "That's not me. That's not." A shock baton touched her neck. Her words turned into a choking gasp. They dragged her away while she twitched, her bare feet scraping against the floor. No one watched for long. Watching made you memorable. Later, I asked a man beside me, quietly, barely moving my lips, what happened to those whose numbers didn't match. He stared at me as if I'd spoken heresy. Then, after a long pause, he said, "They fixed the problem." That was all. I began to understand the rules of this place. Error was unforgivable, but truth was negotiable. If a clerk misfiled you, the ledger became your reality. If a cogitator assigned you to a different category, you became that category. Accuracy was not about reflecting life. It was about maintaining the flow of paperwork, ensuring quotas were met, ensuring the machine of war and labor never paused to consider whether the fuel screaming in its furnace was human. On the 3rd or 4th cycle, I lost count. We were given our first official ration in this facility. It arrived through a slot in the wall, a slab of protein paste wrapped in waxed paper and a cup of water that tasted faintly of rust. The paste was grey and gritty, clinging to my teeth, but my body devoured it anyway. Hunger made everything holy. A voice crackled overhead, reciting a litany in a monotone. Let the unclean be made useful. Let the condemned be made obedient. Let the number be true, for the number is the emperor's measure. Some of the prisoners murmured the words back. Others didn't. I didn't at first. I felt stubborn, foolishly attached to my old self. Then a guard walked the pen's perimeter, eyes scanning for signs of dissent, baton hanging loosely at his side. I mouthed the words without sound. It was safer to be seen complying, even if the compliance was empty. At some point, a clerk came to the pen with a stack of slates and a servo, skull hovering close behind. He read out numbers, not names, and those numbers stepped forward like summoned spirits. Each time he spoke, a person detached from the mass and vanished through the gate, escorted by guards. Some returned hours later. Some did not. When my number was called, it took me a heartbeat to recognize it as mine. That realization hit harder than any baton. The number had already begun to root itself in me, wrapping around my thoughts like barbed wire. I stepped forward, hands trembling, and the clerk glanced up for the first time, not at my face, but at the burned digits on my chest. "Confirmed," he said, satisfied. "Asset ready for transfer." Asset, not prisoner, not citizen. Asset. I was led into another corridor, past locked doors and warning sigils, toward a chamber where the air vibrated with machinery. Along the walls, I saw others like me moving in lines, their chests marked, their eyes hollow. Some were missing teeth. Some limped. Some had shaved heads with fresh staples along the scalp, as if something had been removed and replaced. A servitor shuffled by, its face a smooth, blank plate, dragging a cart of restraints. It did not look at me because it could not. In that moment, I felt a sudden, irrational terror that my path might end the same way, not with death, but with a continuation stripped of self. The clerk stopped at a door reinforced with heavy bolts, and a purity seal hanging from its handle. He pressed his thumb to a sensor. The door unlocked with a groan. Inside was a room filled with racks of equipment, stacks of fatigues, crates of ammunition, and the smell of oil so thick it coated the back of my throat. An officer stood at a desk, his uniform crisp despite the grime, a small shrine of candles and bone charms arranged beside his paperwork. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a cut of meat, evaluating, already imagining how it will be used. "Next," he said. I opened my mouth to speak my name. No sound came. Even if it had, it would have meant nothing. By the time I stepped back into the corridor with a new set of orders stamped into my file, I had stopped correcting anyone who forgot I was human. It was easier to let the number do the talking. Numbers didn't beg. Numbers didn't argue. Numbers didn't break the flow. They just moved forward until they were spent. They called it training, but that word implies intention beyond exhaustion. What we received was erosion, deliberate and methodical, applied until nothing remained that could resist. We were marched from the holding pens into a yard carved between manufactory walls, open to the polluted sky where ash drifted like grey snow. Sirens wailed somewhere far above us, a constant reminder that the hive never slept, never paused, never cared. The instructors arrived late and angry, which I later learned was the proper state for anyone given authority over the condemned. They wore armor mismatched and scarred, plates replaced without concern for symmetry. Their faces were hidden behind rebrither masks that hissed with every breath, turning them into faceless extensions of command. When they spoke, it was through amplifiers that distorted their voices into something metallic and cruel, as if the words themselves had been processed and stripped of mercy. We were ordered to stand at attention. No one explained what that meant. Some stood straight, others hunched from habit or injury. The first blow fell without warning, a shocked baton cracking against a man's knee, dropping him with a scream. The instructor leaned close to the fallen figure, visor inches from his face. "VAT." The amplifier boomed, as incorrect. From that moment on, instruction was delivered exclusively through pain. We were shouted at until fear drowned out comprehension, then beaten for failing to obey orders that contradicted one another. Run forward, stop, drop, get up, faster, slower, kneel, don't kneel. Each mistake was punished, not to correct us, but to remind us that correction was irrelevant. Compliance mattered only insofar as it proved we were still capable of reacting. Weapons were issued on the second cycle. They were old, their surfaces pitted and worn smooth by generations of hands. No one explained how to use them. A crate was opened, rifles tossed out like scrap, and we were told to make ready. Those who hesitated were struck. Those who fumbled were struck harder. One man pulled the trigger by accident, and the shot tore into the ground at his feet. The instructor shot him in the head without comment, and stepped over the body to continue the lesson. I learned by watching, by mimicking the movements of those who seemed less likely to die in the next minute. I learned the weight of the rifle, the stiffness of its trigger, the way it kicked into my shoulder hard enough to bruise. I learned how to clear a jam by feel alone, fingers working while my eyes stayed forward, because looking down invited a baton across the face. Every lesson was paid for in blood, either my own or someone else's. Rations were issued once per cycle, sometimes twice if quotas allowed. They came in metal trays slid across a counter by servitors whose augmetic limbs clicked softly as they moved. The food tasted of grit and chemicals, a paste that coated the tongue and left a bitter aftertaste that lingered for hours. It was barely enough to keep us upright. Hunger gnawed constantly, a dull ache that sharpened during exertion until my vision blurred at the edges. Water was rationed more carefully. We learned to drink slowly, savoring each mouthful, letting it sit on the tongue before swallowing. Those who gulped found themselves dry, mouthed and dizzy long before the next issue. A man collapsed during drills one cycle, his legs folding beneath him like paper. The instructors watched him twitch for a moment, then dragged him aside. He did not return. His rifle was handed to the next man in line. At night, if it could be called night, we were herded into barracks that smelled of unwashed bodies and disinfectant. Bunks were stacked 3 high, metal frames bolted to the walls. There were fewer bunks than bodies. The unassigned slept on the floor, curled around their weapons like talismans. I took a middle bunk when I could, not for comfort, but because it was harder to be pulled out of it unnoticed. Sleep came in fragments, broken by alarms, by screams from somewhere down the corridor, by the constant thrum of machinery that vibrated through the walls and into my bones. Dreams, when they came, were of paperwork and corridors, of doors that would not open and numbers that changed when I tried to read them. I woke each time with my heart racing, hands clawing at the air as if searching for something already lost. Each cycle ended with prayers. We were lined up in the yard, bruised and bleeding, and a robed priest would step forward, flanked by armed guards. He carried a book bound in cracked leather and metal, its pages yellowed and stiff. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he spoke of duty and redemption. He told us that our suffering was a gift, that pain was the Imperium's way of shaping us into something useful. He told us that obedience would cleanse us of our sins, that each order followed without hesitation brought us closer to absolution. I listened because listening cost nothing. Around me, some mouthed the words with him, desperate for meaning. Others stared straight ahead, eyes empty. I felt something shift inside me during those sermons, a subtle rearranging of priorities. Survival began to outweigh dignity. Obedience began to feel less like surrender and more like strategy. On the 5th or 6th cycle of training, they introduced live fire exercises. We were marched to a range carved into the side of the hive, its walls reinforced with layers of plasteel and prayer scrolls. Targets were raised at varying distances. Silhouettes shaped like humanoid figures, painted a dull red that flaked with each impact. We were ordered to fire until the targets dropped. Those who missed were corrected. A man to my left panicked when his rifle jammed. He tried to clear it the way he'd seen others do, fingers shaking. The instructor didn't wait. A baton cracked against the man's skull, dropping him. The instructor knelt, cleared the jam with a practiced motion, then placed the rifle back in the man's hands and shocked him awake. Again, the amplifier growled. The man fired, hit the target, and collapsed sobbing. He was left where he fell. By then I had learned to suppress reaction. Fear wasted energy. Pain was inevitable. Flinching only invited more. I focused on the simple mechanics: breathe, aim, fire. The recoil bruised my shoulder, the report ringing in my ears even through the cheap ear protection we were issued. When my target dropped, no one acknowledged it. Success was expected. Failure was punished. Between drills, we were given lectures on battlefield doctrine, delivered by officers who never removed their helmets. They spoke of formations, of advance and suppression, of objectives and acceptable losses. We were never told where we would be deployed. That knowledge was deemed unnecessary. "You will know where to go when you are told," one officer said. "Until then, concern yourself with obeying." People began to disappear more frequently. Someone would be present at morning roll, then gone by evening. Sometimes we saw the bodies, laid out near the medica station, covered with sheets that did nothing to hide the shape beneath. Sometimes there was no evidence at all. A bunk empty, a rifle reassigned, a number crossed off a slate. I stopped asking questions. Questions marked you as someone still attached to outcomes. By the end of training, if there was an end, I could barely remember who I had been before. My body was a map of bruises and half-healed cuts. My hands were calloused, my movements efficient. When an instructor shouted, I reacted before thinking. When a baton cracked, I braced for impact instead of flinching. The number on my chest felt less like an insult and more like a truth. On the final cycle, after a drill that left 3 people dead and 5 unconscious, we were assembled one last time in the yard. The priest returned, his voice rising above the wind and the distant machinery. You have been found wanting, he said, and there was no anger in it, and so you have been made useful. I felt no pride at those words, no relief, only a deep, settling weariness. Training had not made us stronger. It had made us smaller, stripped us down to the parts that could still function under pressure. We were tools now, honed by neglect and fear. As we were marched back toward the barracks to await reassignment, I realized something with a clarity that frightened me more than any baton. I no longer expected to survive what came next, and worse, I was beginning to accept that expectation as reasonable. They told us we were being issued, not deployed, not reassigned, issued as if we were crates of ration paste or coils of promethium hose. The word came from a Vox speaker bolted high on the barracks wall, its grill clogged with dust and devotional wax. The announcement was preceded by a chime, a thin, cheerful sound that did not belong in a place like this. When it rang, everybody in the room stiffened. When the chime ended, the voice followed, clipped, monotone, bureaucratic. Penal assets, prepare for consecration and collaring. Non-compliance will be corrected. The barracks emptied in a disciplined shuffle. Training had made us quick at lining up, quick at swallowing fear. We moved through corridors painted with warning stripes and faded scripture, past doors stamped with sigils that promised sterilization, quarantine, summary execution. A few of the newer replacements still glanced around with wide eyes, still tried to catch meaning in symbols and scraps of conversation. The rest of us looked straight ahead. Looking sideways was how you found new reasons to panic. The consecration chamber sat deep in the facility's belly, where the air was warmer and tasted faintly of burnt incense. It was an old room, older than the uniforms, older than the men who commanded us, built when the hive still pretended it was a place of industry rather than a place of consumption. The ceiling arched high, supported by pillars plated with beaten copper. Purity seals hung from chains like rotting fruit, their wax cracked, their parchment curled and yellowed. Rows of candles burned in alcoves, their flames trembling in unseen currents, painting the walls with wavering shadows. At the center stood a dais of metal grating. Above it, suspended by cables, hung an array of servo arms and needle rigs. The arms were stained. The needles glinted. Beneath them, a drain ran the length of the floor, its grate dark with old residue. The smell of disinfectant fought with the smell of blood and lost. A priest waited beside the dais, robed in black and red, his vestments embroidered with symbols that promised salvation and threatened punishment in the same breath. His face was hidden behind a mask of hammered steel, shaped into a stern, expressionless visage. A censer swung from his belt, trailing thick smoke that clung to our lungs. He held a book open in one gauntleted hand, and in the other a branding iron whose head was shaped like a jagged sigil. The first in line was marched forward. He was a broad man, shoulders scarred from baton strikes, eyes dull with fatigue. He did not resist when the guards forced him onto the dais. Servo arms descended with insect precision, clamps snapping around his wrists and ankles. He tried to speak, perhaps a plea, perhaps a curse, but the priest raised a hand and began to chant. The chant was not comforting. It was a list, a recitation of codes, of decrees, of passages from ancient law. It spoke of the emperor's authority as if it were an equation: sin plus service equals absolution. The priest's voice echoed off the metal and stone, filling the chamber with a cold certainty. Then the iron touched flesh. The man screamed. The sound ripped through the room, raw and involuntary, and I felt it in my teeth. The sigil burned into his shoulder, a smell of cooking meat rising thickly as the priest held the iron in place longer than necessary. Not because of sadism, though there was plenty of that in the Imperium, but because ritual demanded duration. The brand had to be thorough. Redemption had to be permanent. When the iron lifted, the man sagged in the clamps, sobbing, breath ragged. Servo arms retracted. Guards hauled him off the dais and dragged him to the side, where a medica station waited. I had expected medica to mean care. It did not. The medici was a narrow table beside a rack of tools. A servitor stood behind it, face replaced by a grill, arms ending in syringe tips and bone saws. It examined the brand without curiosity, then slapped a strip of adhesive over it, already stained with someone else's blood, and pushed the man away. Infection was not a priority. Function was. If he could walk, he could serve. I watched the adhesive peel slightly at the edges as the man was shoved toward the exit. Already the brand was swelling, angry and wet. No one paused to ensure it would heal. Healing was a luxury for those whose bodies were expected to last. The line moved. One by one, people were branded. Some fainted. Some bit their tongues until blood ran down their chins, trying to keep silent. Those who screamed were not punished for screaming. Screaming was allowed. It was part of the soundscape of obedience. What was not allowed was resistance. Pulling against clamps, thrashing, trying to twist away. Those who tried were shocked into stillness and branded anyway, their bodies twitching as flesh sizzled. When my number was called, my legs felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. I stepped forward because stepping forward was what my body did now when commanded. The days waited like an altar. The clamps snapped shut around me, cold metal biting skin. I stared up at the servo arms overhead and saw old flakes of dried blood clinging to their joints. The priest leaned close. His mask reflected the lumen light in dull highlights. "Confess," he said softly, almost kindly. My throat was dry. The words stuck. I didn't know what confession was supposed to look like when your crime had been a missed form and your life had already been rewritten into a number. Still, something in me, a reflex of upbringing, forced sound out. "I failed." I croaked. The priest nodded, satisfied. "You have failed. Therefore, you will serve." The iron pressed into my shoulder. Pain is too small a word for what followed. It was heat that didn't stay on the surface but sank inward, biting through skin and into muscle, searing the nerves into wild brightness. The smell of my own flesh rose into my nose, and my stomach lurched. I tried to scream and only managed a strangled sound, because the shock of it stole breath. My vision tunneled. For a heartbeat, the chamber narrowed to nothing but the priest's mask and the iron's head. When it lifted, the world rushed back in with nauseating clarity. My shoulder throbbed, each pulse of blood bringing a fresh wave of agony. Tears ran down my face without permission. The clamps released. I almost fell. A guard caught my arm, not gently, not cruelly, just firmly enough to keep me upright. The medicus station was worse because it was indifferent. The servitor's syringe plunged into the meat near the brand, injecting something that burned cold, then numb. It slapped an adhesive strip over the wound and turned away before I could even steady myself. I stumbled toward the next station, shoulder screaming under the cheap bandage. That was the brand, ownership written in pain. The collar came after. We were marched into a second chamber, smaller, more clinical. The incense was replaced by the sharp odor of machine oil and sterilizing agents. Rows of workbenches held stacks of metal rings, each fitted with wiring, tiny indicator lights, and an engraved serial number. Above the benches hung chains and hooks and tools designed to open flesh without killing it. The technicians here wore sealed masks and aprons. They moved with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times, and would do it thousands more. A clerk stood near the entrance with a slate, ticking off numbers as each of us stepped forward. "Next," he said, as if announcing a ration line. I stood before a bench while a technician picked up a collar and weighed it in his hands. It looked heavier than it had any right to be, thick metal, studded with rivets, the inside lined with teeth, like protrusions that would bite skin. A small cogitator module sat at the back, its surface etched with warning sigils. "This is your reassurance," the technician said through his mask, voice muffled. "It ensures your continued loyalty." I tried to swallow. My throat felt too narrow. He lifted the collar and opened it with a twist, the metal segments parting with a click. Then he set it around my neck. The teeth pressed into my skin. Not enough to pierce deeply, but enough that I felt them constantly, a ring of pressure that promised what it could become. The collar clicked shut with finality. A small light blinked once, then steadied. The technician tugged it, testing. I flinched, and the teeth bit harder. He nodded as if satisfied by my reaction. A second technician stepped close with a wiring probe and pressed it against the cogitator module. The collar hummed, a low, steady vibration that traveled through my jaw and into my skull. It felt like a wasp nest waking. For a moment, my teeth chattered uncontrollably. My hands clenched. The hum stopped. Functional, the technician said. A clerk leaned in, scanned my collar's serial, and logged it against my number. His stylus scratched across the slate. My fate was now bound not just to paperwork, but to hardware. I could be tracked. I could be corrected. I could be ended with a command. They sent us into a waiting area to recover, though recovery was not the purpose. People sat slumped against the walls, hands trembling as they explored the metal around their throats. A few whispered prayers. One man tried to wedge his fingers beneath the collar, trying to pull it away from his skin. He managed barely a millimeter before the collar emitted a sharp tone and shocked him. His body convulsed, back arching, and he collapsed, foam at the corners of his mouth. When he stopped twitching, the guards dragged him away. No one else tested their collar after that. I sat with my back against the cold wall, shoulders shaking. The brand on my shoulder throbbed beneath the adhesive strip. The collar's weight made my neck ache. Every breath brushed my skin against metal, reminding me that my own throat no longer belonged to me. A priest walked among us, speaking softly now, as if addressing children. "Be grateful," he murmured. "The collar is love made tangible. It keeps you from straying. It keeps you from wasting your redemption." I wanted to spit. I wanted to laugh. Both impulses died under the simple knowledge that the collar could hear me, even if it couldn't read thoughts. In that moment, the invisible chains I'd felt during training became visible, metallic, undeniable. From that hour on, disobedience meant obliteration, not punishment, and it didn't even feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a clause in a contract, clear, absolute, and already signed in ink and flesh. They woke us before the alarms, not with sirens or shouted orders, but with the sudden tightening of our collars, a brief, sharp constriction that stole breath and snapped us upright in our bunks. It was an efficient way to roast the condemned. No wasted noise, no warning. Just pain calibrated to say attention is required now. When the pressure eased, I was already on my feet, heart hammering, fingers numb as they closed around my rifle. The barracks lights flared to full brightness, harsh enough to make my eyes water. Guards moved through the rows, batons ready, counting bodies and checking numbers burned into fabric. One man was slow to rise, tangled in his blanket. A baton cracked against his shin. He cried out and scrambled upright, apologizing through clenched teeth. No one acknowledged him. The count continued. Accuracy mattered more than suffering. We were marched to the transports in silence. Outside, the air tasted wrong, thick with smoke and chemical residue that scratched at the back of my throat. The sky above the hive was a roiling smear of gray and orange, lit intermittently by distant flashes that might have been lightning or artillery. It didn't matter which. Both meant the same thing. The transports were armored boxes on trades, their interiors bare except for bench rails and restraint hooks. We packed in shoulder to shoulder, collars clinking softly when we shifted. The doors slammed shut, plunging us into dim red light. Engines roared, and the vehicle lurched forward. Someone began to pray under their breath. Someone else vomited onto the floor grating. The smell spread quickly. No one complained. As we moved, a Vox unit crackled to life overhead. An officer's voice filled the compartment, flat, rehearsed, utterly unconcerned with whether we understood. "Penal assets. You are being deployed to a forward engagement zone. Your role is advance and reveal. You will proceed as ordered. Retreat is unauthorized. Failure will be corrected." That was the briefing. The transport slowed, then stopped with a jarring impact that rattled my teeth. The doors opened, and heat rushed in, hotter than the hive, heavy with the stench of burning fuel, scorched earth, and decay. We disembarked into a landscape that looked like the aftermath of a long forgotten war, except it was still ongoing. The ground was churned into mud and ash by tracked vehicles and shelling. Craters pocked the terrain, some filled with stagnant water, others with bodies, so many bodies, they lay twisted in unnatural poses, uniforms shredded, faces blackened or bloated. Some were recent enough that flies swarmed thickly. rising in clouds when disturbed. Others were older, reduced to bones and scraps of fabric half buried in the mud. The air buzzed constantly, not just with insects, but with the distant crack of gunfire and the low thunder of artillery. It was a soundscape of destruction, layered and endless. We were herded into formation near the edge of a shallow trench. Ahead of us stretched open ground, broken by debris and the occasional skeletal ruin of a structure that might once have been a hab, block or manufactorum outpost. Smoke drifted across the field in slow curtains, obscuring whatever waited beyond. An officer stood on a raised platform behind us, flanked by heavy weapons teams who pointed their guns not outward, but inward toward us. His helmet's visor was opaque, reflecting our ranks back at us as a mass of numbered chests and hollow eyes. "You will advance when ordered," he said over the vox, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "You will draw enemy fire. Your deaths will identify hostile positions for correction by supporting units. This is your service. This is your redemption." There it was. The truth spoken plainly without ornament. My collar hummed softly, as if in agreement. The order came, "Advance." We climbed out of the trench. At first, nothing happened. We moved forward in a ragged line, boots sinking into mud, weapons held ready though no targets were visible. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the artillery. Every step felt like a mistake. Every breath tasted of ash, then the air snapped. The first shots cracked overhead, sharp and sudden. Dirt kicked up near my feet. Someone to my right stumbled and fell, a neat hole punched through his chest. He hit the ground hard, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly as blood bubbled from his lips. I stepped over him because the press of bodies behind me left no room to stop. More shots followed. The sound was deafening now, rifle fire, heavy weapons, the scream of incoming shells. People began to drop all around me. Some fell screaming, clutching shattered limbs. Others simply collapsed, their numbers disappearing into the mud. The smell of blood joined the smoke, metallic and thick, making my stomach churn. I raised my rifle and fired blindly toward the flashes in the distance, not because I thought I'd hit anything, but because firing felt like doing something other than waiting to be killed. The recoil jarred my already bruised shoulder, sending a spike of pain through the fresh brand. I gritted my teeth and fired again. Someone slammed into me from behind, a body propelled forward by momentum even after life had left it. We both went down, sliding in the mud. I scrambled to my feet, hands slick with someone else's blood. My collar tightened briefly, a warning pulse urging me forward. I lurched ahead, breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no retreat. I could see it clearly now. Heavy weapons teams behind us, muzzles tracking our movement. Anyone who turned back would be corrected instantly. The only direction that did not guarantee immediate death was forward, and even that offered no promise beyond a few more seconds. I watched a woman a few meters ahead take a round to the leg. She fell, screaming, trying to crawl. A second later, her collar detonated. The explosion was small but violent, a sharp crack followed by a spray of blood and bone. Her body went limp instantly, head rolling to one side at an impossible angle. The message was unmistakable: wounded was not an excuse. Falling behind was not permitted. Something inside me broke then, not with a dramatic snap, but with a quiet surrender. Fear didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became dull, constant, manageable. I stopped thinking in terms of survival and started thinking in terms of movement. Step. Fire. Step. Don't fall. The ground ahead erupted as a shell landed, throwing bodies and debris into the air. I was knocked flat, ears ringing, vision filled with sparks. For a moment I lay there stunned, cheek pressed into mud that tasted of rot and oil. I thought dimly that this might be it, that the collar would sense my stillness and end it. It didn't. I forced myself up, legs trembling. Around me the line had thinned dramatically. Where there had been dozens, now there were perhaps a handful still moving. I saw enemy fire positions now, dark shapes in the ruins, muzzle flashes stuttering from windows and rubble piles. We had done our job. We had revealed them. That knowledge did not save us. Heavy weapons thundered from behind as supporting units finally opened fire, shells screaming overhead to obliterate the revealed positions. The ground shook with the impacts. The ruins ahead vanished in fire and smoke. I felt a grim, hollow satisfaction at that. Our deaths had been useful, A sharp impact slammed into my side, knocking the breath from my lungs. I staggered, pain flaring. I looked down to see blood soaking my fatigues, dark and spreading. Not a fatal hit, I realized distantly. Not yet, my collar hummed. I stumbled forward another step, then another, legs weakening. Around me, the last of my battalion fell. Numbers disappeared one by one, swallowed by mud and smoke. I was alone now, advancing through a field of corpses toward a ruin that no longer existed. Survival felt wrong, like theft. When I finally collapsed, falling to my knees, the collar did not detonate immediately. Perhaps the signal was delayed. Perhaps someone was still deciding. I waited, breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at the mud inches from my face. The explosion never came. Hands grabbed me instead, rough, efficient. I was dragged backward out of the kill zone, through the mud and blood I had crossed moments before. Medici personnel worked quickly, slapping sealant onto my wound, injecting stimulants that burned like fire in my veins. I screamed and then laughed, the sound hysterical and broken. I had lived, not because I deserved to, not because I was strong, but because the Imperium had decided it could still use me. And that, I realized as they hauled me onto another transport, was far worse than dying out there in the mud. They patched me just well enough to stand. The Medici bay was a converted cargo hold that smelled of antiseptic, failing to mask rot. Bodies lay in rows on metal tables, some whole, some arranged into something resembling completeness by tarps and straps. Servo arms whirred overhead, dipping and cutting and sealing with mechanical indifference. A red lumen pulsed slowly, like a tired heart. I remember staring at it while a needle stitched my side closed, each pull sending a white hot line of pain through my ribs. No anesthetic was offered. Pain meant you were still responsive. A stim shot burned its way into my bloodstream, dragging me upright against my will. My hands shook. My vision sharpened too quickly, details snapping into focus with cruel clarity. I could see the cracks in the ceiling plating, the dried blood under my fingernails, the way the brand on my shoulder had split and oozed beneath its filthy adhesive strip. The medic glanced at me once, really just at my collar's light, and moved on. Fit for redeployment, he muttered. That phrase followed me everywhere after that. Fit for redeployment. It didn't mean healed. It didn't mean safe. It meant I could still walk, still carry a rifle, still die in the correct direction. Anything beyond that was wasteful consideration. They didn't give us time to mourn the ones who hadn't been dragged back. There were no names to recite, no rites to perform beyond the brief flick of a clerk's stylus as numbers were crossed off a slate. We were marched from the Medici bay straight into another staging area, still stained with the residue of previous deployments. Blood never really washed out of the floor seams. It soaked in and stayed, a permanent ledger written in rust, brown streaks. Replacements arrived while we waited. They were easy to spot. Their eyes still moved too much, darting around as they tried to understand where they were and what they were seeing. Their uniforms were cleaner, their numbers freshly burned. Some of them still had hair that hadn't been shaved down to regulation stubble. They smelled less like sweat and fear and more like whatever place they'd been taken from, manufactorums, hab blocks, prison holds. The guards shoved them into line with us without ceremony. No introductions were made. No explanations given. We were one unit now, regardless of how long any of us had been here. The officer's voice came over the vox again, unchanged, as if it had not just sent dozens of people to their deaths. Objective incomplete. It said, enemy resistance persists. Penal assets will advance to secondary coordinates. Secondary. As if the first assault had been an inconvenience rather than a slaughter. The march to the new engagement zone took hours. The terrain grew worse with every step, less solid ground, more rubble and corpses. The smell was overwhelming now, a layered stench of decay and chemical burn that coated the inside of my nose and refused to leave. Flies clustered thickly around us, crawling over exposed skin, getting caught in mouths and eyes. No one bothered to swat them away. Energy was too precious. Sleep came in stolen moments during brief halts, bodies slumping against one another for warmth and support. I learned the weight of the man beside me by heart, the way his breathing hitched when he slept, the faint wheeze in his chest that told me he wouldn't last long. We never exchanged names. There was no point. Orders came through the Vox in bursts: advance, halt, spread, regroup, always forward, always into worse ground. Commanders never appeared in person. They spoke to us from somewhere safe. Their voices carried on clean signals that crackled only slightly with interference. They didn't need to see us. The slates showed numbers, and numbers were sufficient. We cleared trenches next. If the open field had been terror, the trenches were horror. They were narrow and deep, walls reinforced with plasteel sheets, slick with moisture and blood. The air inside them was stagnant, heavy with the smell of rot and old explosives. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, sometimes piled so thickly that we had to climb over them, boots slipping on slick surfaces. Faces stared up at us from the mud, mouths frozen open, eyes long since clouded. We were ordered down into the trenches with bayonets fixed. Close combat is different. There is no distance to hide behind, no illusion of abstraction. You feel everything, the resistance as metal meets flesh, the warmth of blood splashing across your hands, the way a body jerks when you strike it in the right place. I remember a man lunging at me from around a corner, his face twisted with the same terror I felt. I don't know if he was an enemy or another condemned soul like me. It didn't matter. Training took over. I stabbed. He fell. I stood there for a moment afterward, chest heaving, staring at what I had done. My collar hummed softly, approvingly. I moved on. The replacements didn't last long. The ones who hesitated, who froze at the first scream or the first close kill, were corrected quickly. A collar would detonate, or a baton would crack, or a stray shot from behind would drop them where they stood. Their bodies became part of the terrain, obstacles to be navigated around in the next push. Between assaults, we slept in the trenches, backs against the wall, rifles across our laps. Sleep was shallow and broken, haunted by screams and the metallic tang of blood that never quite left my mouth. When I closed my eyes, I saw numbers floating in the dark, blinking out one by one. Sometimes I woke convinced my own had gone dark. Sermons continued even here. A priest would arrive after an assault, robes splattered with mud, voice amplified over the din. He spoke of perseverance, of faith proven through obedience. He told us that each grave we filled was a step closer to victory. That doubt was a sin more dangerous than the enemy. I listened because the alternative was thinking too much about what I was doing, about how easily my hands now moved through acts that would once have horrified me. Friends, if that word still applied, vanished without warning. The man who slept beside me with the wheeze in his chest took a round during a trench sweep and dropped without a sound. His body lay half submerged in mud until a shell collapsed the trench wall and buried him completely. No one noted his absence. His rifle was picked up by a replacement an hour later. The battlefield stretched on endlessly, a landscape of ruin that seemed to regenerate destruction as fast as we inflicted it. Every position we took revealed another behind it. Every victory demanded another advance. Time lost meaning. We lived from order to order, from assault to assault. Our existence measured in meters gained and bodies spent. Somewhere along the line, I stopped wondering if redemption was possible. The concept felt abstract, like a story told to children who had never seen the hive's lower levels. All that mattered now was obedience, instant, unquestioning, complete. It was the only thing that kept the collar silent. It was the only thing that delayed the inevitable. I began to envy the dead for their silence. They did not have to listen to the Vox crackle with new orders. They did not have to drag themselves out of shallow sleep to march again. They did not have to feel the weight of the collar, or the burn of the brand, or the slow erosion of whatever part of them had once hoped for more. Each day carved something out of me and left nothing in its place, and still the orders came, always forward, always into the graves. By the time they told us this war was righteous, I no longer remembered what unrighteousness felt like. The sermons changed first. Where once the priests had spoken of redemption as something distant but attainable, a light at the end of obedience, they now spoke only of purity through function. The words were harsher, stripped of metaphor. Faith was no longer belief. Faith was compliance. Faith was measured in how quickly you moved when ordered, how little you hesitated when told to kill, how quietly you died when required. They preached between assaults, standing on mounds of rubble slick with blood. Their voices carried over vox, grills crackling with interference. Their robes were torn and stained, purity seals plastered over rents like futile bandages. The books they carried were swollen with moisture, pages stuck together by grime and rain and something darker. Still, they read from them, because ritual mattered more than clarity. Doubt, one priest intoned, is treason that begins in the mind. I felt that sentence settle into me like a command subroutine. The battlefield had become a maze of scars, trenches collapsed into one another, ruins ground down into jagged teeth of stone and metal. Smoke never fully cleared. Even when the guns fell silent for an hour, the air still trembled with distant detonations, a constant reminder that violence was merely resting, not ending. Ash coated everything: our uniforms, our weapons, our skin. It worked its way into wounds and stayed there, turning cuts into infections and infections into something worse. Roll calls grew shorter, each morning. If morning was the correct word for the brief cycle of relative quiet before the next assault, a clerk would arrive with a slate, flanked by guards. He would read numbers in a flat voice, checking them off as those still breathing responded. When a number went unanswered, the clerk paused only long enough to confirm the absence visually. Then the stylus moved, a line was drawn. The slate updated, no comment was made, no prayer offered. The dead did not require acknowledgement beyond accurate accounting. Friends vanished like that. The man who had once shared a ration with me in the trench, splitting it without speaking, was gone one morning. His place in line empty, his rifle already reassigned. I caught myself starting to ask where he was, then stopped. The question felt obscene, like asking why rust spreads on metal. The answer was self-evident and irrelevant. I learned to stop forming attachments. Or perhaps attachments simply stopped forming on their own, eroded by repetition and fear. Faces blurred together, voices lost distinction. People became shapes that moved alongside me, then disappeared. The only constant was the weight of my rifle and the pressure of the collar around my throat. The collar had become more than a threat. It was a presence. I felt it when I hesitated, a subtle tightening, a reminder before correction became necessary. I felt it when I slowed, when exhaustion threatened to pull me under. Sometimes it hummed for no apparent reason, a low vibration that set my teeth on edge and made my heart race. I never knew if it was a malfunction or a test. Either way, the lesson was the same. I was always being watched. Sleep offered no refuge. When I slept, I dreamed of standing in endless lines, numbers stretching into the distance, each one waiting to be called. I dreamed of slates filling with red ink. I dreamed of my collar detonating over and over, always waking just before the moment of release. I woke drenched in sweat, hands clawing at my neck, only to feel cold metal beneath my fingers. Somewhere in those nights, my thoughts began to narrow. I stopped thinking in sentences and started thinking in directives. Advance, fire, reload, move, take cover, don't stop, don't look back. When fear surfaced, it was quickly drowned by routine. Routine was safe. Routine kept the collar quiet. Routine kept me alive. For whatever that word still meant. The replacements continued to arrive, and they continued to die. They were younger now, I noticed. Or perhaps I was just more attuned to the way innocence looked when stripped bare. Some still flinched at explosions. Some still cried out when wounded. They learned quickly, or they didn't learn at all. The battlefield was an efficient teacher. I caught my reflection once in a shard of broken plasteel. It startled me. My face looked older, thinner, eyes sunken and shadowed. The number burned into my chest was dark with grime. Edges cracked where the fabric had been repaired too many times. The brand on my shoulder had healed into a twisted scar, puckered and angry. I barely recognized myself. That realization lasted only a moment before an order snapped my attention back where it belonged. We were advancing again, through a manufacturing complex reduced to a skeleton of girders and smashed machinery. The smell of oil and burned flesh mixed into something nauseatingly sweet. Enemy resistance flared sporadically, bursts of fire from behind conveyor belts and collapsed walls. We returned fire without thought, bodies moving as one. Drilled into cohesion by fear rather than trust. A man beside me, newer, judging by the stiffness of his movements, froze when a blast threw debris across our path. He stood there, eyes wide, breathing fast. For a second, I saw myself in him as I had been weeks ago, when the first shots cracked overhead. I didn't shout at him. I didn't encourage him. I shoved him forward. He stumbled, regained his footing, and moved. A heartbeat later, a round took him in the back. He fell without a sound. I stepped past him without slowing. The realization that followed was quiet and devastating. I had not acted out of malice. I had acted out of instinct. The part of me that might once have hesitated was gone, worn away by repetition and fear, until only obedience remained. After the assault, the priest came again. His voice was hoarse now, strained by smoke and constant shouting. He spoke of victory being near, of the enemy weakening. He spoke of faith tested and proven. He looked out over us, what remained of us, and raised his hands. "You are the emperor's will made manifest," he said. "You have no need for hope. Obedience is enough." I believed him, not because the words were convincing, but because believing them required less effort than resisting. Hope implied an alternative. Obedience was simple. Obedience was survival. Obedience was silence. The battlefield stretched on, endless and consuming, mirroring the hollowing out of my own soul. I no longer remembered what redemption was supposed to feel like. I no longer cared to remember. The idea of returning to anything resembling a life felt foreign, almost absurd. All that existed was the next order, the next advance, the next number to be crossed off, and somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and fear, I felt the shape of the ending approaching, not as a dramatic finale, but as an administrative conclusion, a final accounting. The order came without ceremony, which was how I knew it was meant to end things. There was no sermon beforehand, no attempt to dress it in meaning. The vox crackled once, briefly, and the officer's voice cut through the smoke and distant gunfire with practiced indifference. Penal assets. Final assault authorized. Advance to marked coordinates. Duration until completion. No mention of extraction. No mention of survival. Just until completion, a phrase as clean and final as a stamped seal. We stood at the edge of what had once been a shrine complex, its spires shattered and its icons blasted into rubble. Fragments of statuary lay half, buried in ash and mud, stone hands reaching skyward, broken faces staring sightlessly at nothing. Candles still burned in sheltered alcoves, their flames guttering weakly, fed by offerings no one would ever collect. The air smelled of incense mixed with rot, a sacrilege so complete it felt deliberate. There were fewer of us now. So few that I could count them without effort, a handful of numbers where there had once been hundreds. Our formation was loose, more suggestion than structure. No one bothered correcting it. There was no point. Behind us, I heard the familiar click of heavy weapons cycling into readiness, not aimed outward, but inward. The reminder was unnecessary, but tradition demanded it. The Imperium never missed an opportunity to be precise about control. My collar buzzed softly, a low, eager vibration. It felt different this time, not a warning, not a correction, but anticipation. I wondered, distantly, if the device could sense the probability curves. If some machine logic had already calculated the likelihood of my continued usefulness and found it negligible. The marked coordinates lay ahead, across open ground that had been scoured flat by bombardment. There was no cover to speak of, only scattered debris and shallow craters filled with foul, smelling water. Smoke drifted lazily across the field, thin enough now that I could see the enemy's last line, clearly entrenched positions dug into the far embankment. Heavy weapons emplacements still active, still hungry. This wasn't about revealing positions anymore. We had done that already. This was about time. A distraction measured in minutes. Advance, the Vox said. I stepped forward. So did the others. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, tearing through the thin line with brutal efficiency. A man to my left took a round to the head and vanished in a spray of red mist and fragments. Another stumbled, clutching his stomach, and detonated an instant later when his collar registered the fall. The sound of it was sharp and final, a punctuation mark in the chaos. I kept moving. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself were trying to hold me back, eager to add me to its collection. My side, poorly healed from the last assault, burned with every movement. My breath rasped, each inhale dragging smoke and ash into my lungs until coughing became inevitable. I coughed anyway. The collar did not tighten. Perhaps it knew this effort was temporary. Rounds cracked past me, some close enough that I felt the heat of their passage. One slammed into my thigh, spinning me sideways and dropping me to a knee. Pain flared, hot and bright. I gasped, fingers digging into the mud. For a moment, I thought that was it. That the collar would end things there, efficiently, denying me even the illusion of struggle. It didn't. I pushed myself back up, legs screaming in protest. Blood soaked my fatigues warm and slick. My vision swam, edges darkening, but the enemy line loomed closer now. I could see individual shapes behind the guns, faces contorted, mouths shouting orders I couldn't hear. They looked terrified. The thought surprised me. They were afraid of us, not because we were skilled, not because we were righteous, but because we did not stop, because even now, even broken and bleeding and nearly spent, we kept advancing. There was nothing to negotiate with, nothing to intimidate. We were already dead. They just hadn't finished the paperwork yet. I fired my rifle until the magazine ran dry, each shot jarring my bruised shoulder, each impact distant and unreal. When it clicked empty, I didn't reload. I dropped it and kept moving, bayonet in hand. Somewhere behind me, I heard the thunder of artillery as supporting units finally committed, shells screaming overhead toward the positions we were drawing fire from. The ground shook violently as explosions tore into the enemy line. Fire blossomed. Concrete and bodies flew apart. The world became noise and light and heat, overwhelming and absolute. I reached the embankment just as another shell hit nearby, throwing me forward. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. I lay there, stunned, cheek pressed against churned earth that still radiated warmth from recent blasts. The collar hummed. This time it was steady, calm. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. Ash drifted down like snow, settling on my face, my chest. The burned number stitched into my uniform. Around me, there was no movement, no shouting, no orders. Just the distant rumble of guns and the crackle of fire consuming what little remained of the shrine. I realized then that I was alone. The last of my battalion was gone, numbers crossed off, assets expended. Objective achieved. I waited for the detonation. It didn't come. Instead, the hum shifted pitch, a brief rising tone that felt almost thoughtful. Then it stopped. The collar went silent. For the first time since it had been placed around my neck, there was nothing, no pressure, no vibration, no warning pulse. Silence. I laughed, a broken sound that tore at my throat and turned into a cough. Blood flecked my lips. I tried to push myself up and failed. My body was finished, even if the collar wasn't ready to admit it. As I lay there, fading, I understood the final cruelty. The Imperium would never record my death. There would be no entry marking when or how I fell. No note of bravery or cowardice. No acknowledgement beyond a check mark beside an objective completed. My existence would end not with a line through my number, but with the quiet assumption that the asset had been consumed as intended. I had been sentenced long before the first shot was fired. The knock on my door had been the beginning of this accounting, and everything since had been a series of deductions. Now, at the end, there was nothing left to subtract. The sky darkened. The noise faded. This confession is all that remains. Not a name, not a number, just the memory of being used and found sufficient.